Hi, and welcome to the first lecture of Period 5, 5.1, Contextualizing Period 5. Period 5 covers the years 1844 to 1877. Now, that's all of the years that will include the Civil War and Reconstruction. The learning objective is explain the context in which the sectional conflict emerged from 1844 to 1877. The first key concept is the United States became more connected with the world, pursued an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and emerged as a destination for many migrants from other countries. The United States engaged in a war with Mexico in 1845 after the annexation of Texas over the boundary of the two countries. The war was a quick victory for the United States, with fighting in South Texas, California, and Mexico City. As a result of the war, the United States gained the Mexican Cession. It included the current southwest of the United States that extends to the Pacific Ocean. In 1844, the United States competed with Great Britain for claims over the Oregon Territory. The United States' belief that the territory belonged to them is made clear in James K. Polk's campaign slogan, 5440 or Fight, referring to the line of latitude that would grant the entirety of the territory to the United States. Eventually, Polk tempered his message and settled to split the territory down the middle and used the 49th parallel as the boundary between the two countries. The expansion of territory in this time period will fuel the debate over the expansion of the institution of slavery that culminates with the Civil War. As the key concept made clear, engaging in expansionist foreign policy with foreign powers, the United States is more connected with the world. The United States experiences its first large wave of migration in this period, primarily coming from Ireland and Germany. The push factor for Irish immigrants was the potato famine, which brought about widespread famine on the island of 6 million people. About 2 million Irish left the island in the middle of the 19th century, and about 1 million of those settled in the United States. German immigrants were fleeing political instability in Central Europe and generally arrived with more resources and settled on farms in the Old Northwest or Great Lakes region. The next key concept covers the expansion of the United States as part of the larger phenomenon of manifest destiny. Popular enthusiasm for U.S. expansion, bolstered by economic and security interests, resulted in the acquisition of new territories, substantial migration westward, and new overseas initiatives. Manifest destiny was the idea that the country was going to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This notion began in the previous historical periods. When colonial charters were first issued, they included language that granted territory all the way to a Western Ocean. The notion grew further after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark's coral discovery actually explored further than the boundary of the territory purchased when they went all the way to the coast in Oregon. Manifest destiny was achieved in phases of large land acquisitions that started with the Louisiana Purchase. In 1845, the annexation of Texas added territory in the southwest and some more land west of the Louisiana Territory. The result of the Mexican-American War extended the boundary all the way to California. Lastly, the addition of the Oregon Territory and a further land purchase from Mexico south of Arizona brings the United States close to the modern contiguous U.S. boundaries. Mining and railroad opportunities in the West drew settlers to populate the new territories. The construction of a transcontinental railroad that started in 1863 is completed in 1869. It connects both parts of the country east and west. Gold and silver is found in the western states, which draws even more settlers. Gold is discovered in California at Sutter's Mill in 1848 and 1849. It causes the California Gold Rush, where settlers come from all parts of the country to prospect for gold along the Sierras in Northern California. There was a similar silver rush in Nevada after the discovery of Comstock Lode, the largest silver deposit ever found in the U.S. Various other mining towns sprang up in the West as mineral deposits were discovered, thus taking the name boom towns. As soon as the mines were exhausted, people abandoned the towns and then they became ghost towns. Once the U.S. established on the West Coast, trade with Asia increases. The United States is responsible for opening up Japan to trade in 1853. They had previously shut themselves off from international trade by choice, and at the end of the Civil War in 1866, the Secretary of State, William Seward, purchases Alaska. At the time, the value of Alaska was not clear to everyone. It was thought that it had been a financial mistake, and people called it Seward's Folly or even Seward's Icebox. At the time, it was not known that Alaska would be full of natural resources and mineral deposits. Seward was ultimately proven to have made a perceptive decision. On to the third key concept. In the 1840s and 1850s, Americans continued to debate questions about rights and citizenship for various groups of U.S. inhabitants. When it comes to immigrants, there is a rise of nativism or anti-immigrant sentiment that tries to limit the rights of newcomers through attempts at lengthening the required amount of time to be eligible for citizenship. This keeps migrants from voting and limits their immigration into the United States as a whole. This begins with some anti-Irish and anti-German sentiments that was sometimes rooted in anti-Catholicism. Nativist efforts to restrict immigration will continue through the 20th century. The Chinese are the immigrant group that nativists targeted in the West Coast. Chinese workers had come to the United States through the West Coast to work on railroads and mines. Their migration patterns usually ended up with a return to China, but they were disliked because they were seen as wage depressors. In the next historical period, further Chinese immigration will be cut off through the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. African American citizenship rights will be restricted severely before being guaranteed by constitutional amendments. In 1857, the Supreme Court case Dred Scott v. Sanford, decided by Roger Taney, states that African Americans are not considered citizens by the U.S. Constitution. And not only are they not considered citizens by the U.S. Constitution, those that are enslaved are considered property. And based on the U.S. Constitution's Fifth Amendment, property cannot be taken away from U.S. citizens without due process. This meant that freedom for enslaved people could not be won by moving to a free state, and that northern states had no right to pass laws that took away Americans' property. This meant that slavery was technically legal everywhere in the United States, regardless if a state had outlawed slavery before. It blew up the slavery debate because it answered the slavery question decisively on the side of the southern states, whereas before, a careful balance had been maintained to keep both sides happy. Finally, Native Americans won't have citizenship until 1924 with a special act of Congress. Because of that, they're going to be prone to having land taken without due process as the United States continue to expand westward. The next key concept moves on to the major event in Period 5, the Civil War. It says, intensified by expansion and deepening regional divisions, debates over slavery and other economic, cultural, and political issues led the nation into civil war. The debate over slavery continued to grow because the country continued to expand its borders. Northern states wanted to keep slavery from spreading into places where it had not been practiced, and southern states wanted to keep allowing slavery in new states to maintain their balance of power in the Senate. The Compromise of 1850 came about as a result of the territory gained in the Mexican-American War. It was meant to try and keep everyone happy on both sides. It tried to limit slavery to certain places, which is what the North wanted, and allowed for the potential for slavery to be legal above the 3630 Missouri Compromise line, which made the South happy. It did this through the concept of popular sovereignty. The populace of each territory was to choose whether or not they would allow slavery in that territory. As further protection of the institution, Congress passed a new Fugitive Slave Act, which went further in guaranteeing the return of enslaved people that had run away. The result of the compromise was that the North grew to become a stauncher supporter of abolition, as the Missouri Compromise had been thrown out, and they now felt that they were forced to enforce Southern laws through the Fugitive Slave Act. The South continued to rely on cotton as their main export and slavery as its main labor force. The importance of the cash crop was clear in its nickname of King Cotton. Since it made up its largest source of wealth, for some, attacking any aspect of the production of cotton felt like an attack on the South as a whole. Lincoln's election was perceived as a precursor for the federal government taking action to end slavery by the South, and it caused South Carolina to secede in December of 1860. As it tries to declare its own independence from the United States, it's also trying to take over all of the federal forts within its territory. Fort Sumter was one such federal fort. The federal troops inside of the fort did not want to just give up the fort to the rebel government, and held out until they began to run low on supplies. Lincoln announced that he would send a resupply of food and not include any weapons or ammo. South Carolina didn't believe that the president would do that and began a bombardment of the fort before the supply ship arrived. South Carolina's secession was based on compact theory. This first showed up in Period 3 and was developed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. It stated that states had come into a pact in the form of the U.S. Constitution, and any time that the pact did not suit them, they were allowed to either nullify or ignore federal law as unconstitutional, or leave that pact whenever they found that it didn't suit them any longer. As South Carolina secedes, others will follow, so by the time that Abraham Lincoln takes office in 1861, there will be 11 states that have seceded from the Union. The next key concept delves deeper into the slavery debate. Ideological and economic differences over slavery produced an array of diverging responses from Americans in the North and South. In the South, slavery was seen as central to the Southern society. We talked about this at the end of Period 4, and this continues into Period 5. In the early days of the Confederacy, the Vice President Alexander Stephens, seen in the top right, makes a speech that's often referred to as the Cornerstone Speech. He says that slavery is the cornerstone to this new Confederacy, the idea that the two different races are unequal, that the white race is better than the black race, and that blacks in the South should be in servitude is central to the Confederacy's existence. This goes beyond the economic importance of cotton to the South. It is one of the most unapologetic support of slavery based on racist ideology in the 19th century. It even resembles John C. Calhoun's Senate speech in which he says that slavery is a positive good in the previous time period. And cotton, as stated before, did make up a large part of why the South was so invested in the institution of slavery. In the North, the abolitionist movement continued to grow. The fugitive slave law that passed as a result of the Compromise of 1850 also could criminalize Northerners who were helping fugitive slaves run away. This made the Northerners much more antagonistic towards slavery. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a long novel that details all of the negative aspects of slavery through a fictionalized account of one enslaved person being sold and separated from his family. It becomes wildly popular, not just in the United States, but also across the world. In Great Britain, it's read among abolitionist circles and creates a moral sympathy for those who are enslaved. The diverse economy in the North led to a greater tendency to oppose slavery, because enslaved labor was a direct competition against free labor, and it depressed the wages of other workers by comparison. However, it is worth mentioning that despite the growing abolitionist sentiment in the North, some Northern institutions were also heavily invested in slavery. Southern plantation owners often used Northern banks to finance purchases of new land and enslaved people. Northern textile factories benefited from the cheap raw material grown in the South with coerced labor. The next key concept covers how slavery impacted national politics. Debates over slavery came to dominate political discussion in the 1850s, culminating in the bitter election of 1860 and the secession of Southern states. Prior to the 1860s, there were two main anti-slavery parties, the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party. The Republican Party, created in 1854, will be the next major party that supports abolition. However, they were more than a one-issue party and took on stances that favored the expansion of the federal government. The Whigs, who had similar ideology, had died out as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the death of Henry Clay. As the Republicans put anti-slavery measures in their party platform, the Free Soil and Liberty Party threw their support behind the Republicans. Support for the Republican Party was limited to the North because it was perceived to be the anti-slavery party. So in the 1860 election, some Southern states didn't even put the Republican Party on their ballots. The Democratic Party, created by Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, was the other major party in the two-party system. Up until this point, it continued to garner support from the entire country. Keeping Northern and Southern support became too difficult as slavery proved to be too much of a divisive issue, and the party split into a Northern and Southern faction. This is a prime example of how deep the sectionalism in the country had grown. The split electorate allows Abraham Lincoln to win the election with a majority of electoral votes, though not with a majority in the popular votes. The way it was possible is that Northern states had larger populations, therefore more electoral votes, and by winning all of the states with the most electoral votes, Lincoln had enough to win. The last three key concepts will cover the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issue of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. The main accomplishment of Reconstruction were the Reconstruction Amendments. Those are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteed the protection of citizenship, and the 15th Amendment grants the right to vote to citizens of the United States. So now anyone who was born in the United States is automatically a citizen, and as long as they are male, they have a right to vote guaranteed to them. During the Reconstruction period, emancipated people were offered help and assistance to try transition into free civil society. The Freedmen's Bureau was an agency created by Congress that offered educational opportunities, healthcare, information on how to vote, and access to land in some cases. However, in 1877, Reconstruction ends after the contested presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. A deal is made between the Republicans and the Democrats that the Republican candidate Hayes would be given the presidency as long as he ended Reconstruction that had been enforced by the military in the South. The support for Reconstruction as a whole had waned due to an economic depression in 1873. As the protections and services for African Americans dwindled, laws that restrict their freedoms were passed by Southern states. The post-Reconstruction period is referred to as the nadir of African American history. that is, the lowest point in their treatment after emancipation, as they are subjected to Jim Crow laws, discriminatory measures, violence, and intimidation. The next key concept covers the advantages that helped the North win the Civil War. The North's great manpower and industrial resources, the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and others, and the decision to emancipate slaves eventually led to the Union military victory over the Confederacy in the devastating Civil War. The North had an advantage in manpower because the North, hereafter referred to as the Union, had larger urban centers and a much larger free population. There were about 23 million people in the Union, whereas there were only 5.5 million free people in the Confederacy. The South had an enslaved population of about 3.5 million for a total population of 9 million. Towards the end of the war, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was so desperate for soldiers that he actually offers African Americans the opportunity to fight for the Confederacy in exchange for their freedom at the end of the war. Railroads are the most important industrial resource that the Union has over the South because they allow the armies to be resupplied and to be moved into the battlefield more quickly. The Navy of the Union and the ability to build more modern ships called Ironsides is instrumental in the Union victory because it allows for the blockade of southern ports. It limits the export of cotton from the South, which would be the only way in which the Confederacy could get any sort of cash or any sort of traded goods to help fight the war. Lincoln's leadership is really important. He comes into office in March of 1861 when the Confederacy had already formed and attacked the Union 1 month into the presidency. Lincoln successfully mobilized troops by calling 75,000 volunteers from the remaining states, even though Congress is in recess. He recognized when generals were ineffective, like John McClellan, and he replaced them with effective ones like Ulysses Grant. Finally, in the early months of his presidency, he keeps Missouri, Kentucky, the new state of West Virginia, Delaware, and most importantly Maryland from joining the Confederacy. All of these states practiced slavery before the war started and could potentially have surrounded the Union's capital of Washington, D.C. if they joined the Confederacy. In the case of Maryland, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus to root out support for the Confederacy. Lincoln's decision to emancipate the enslaved through the Emancipation Proclamation also helped win the war because it changed the main motives of the war. Up until that point, it had been primarily to maintain the Union together. Now, a moral motive for the war is added and it stops the British from helping the Confederacy. The British were still very much reliant on southern cotton, though they were in the process of finding substitute suppliers. They had flirted with the idea of helping the Confederacy. In fact, there were several instances in which they attempted to help the Confederacy, but a combination of abolitionist sentiment at home and tense diplomatic relations with the Union made them back down. As soon as the Civil War became a war about freedom of enslaved people, the British stopped thinking about helping the Confederacy in any way. The Emancipation Proclamation also encouraged black soldiers in the North to enlist and help fight, because they saw it as an opportunity to fight for others to gain their freedom. The famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass even became a recruiter for black regiments in the Civil War. The devastation of war was widespread. Most of the battlefields and destruction were limited to the South. The Civil War was a war of attrition. That means that both sides kept using more troops and weapons in battles that yielded higher numbers of casualties on both sides. The direct military tactics that were being used in the middle of the 19th century, when used with large amounts of soldiers, were going to yield high amounts of casualties. Armies would face each other in large numbers, shoot volleys of shots against each other as they marched closer and closer, and ended up in hand-to-hand combat. It results in the Civil War having the highest casualties in proportion to the population than any other American war, and that is still true to this day. After the war, Southern infrastructure and its economy were destroyed. The Confederate capital of Richmond, seen in the top right, and Union soldiers pulling up Southern rails on the bottom left, show the extent of the destruction. By the end of the war, all of this needed to be rebuilt. The final key concept covers the impacts of the Civil War and the Reconstruction that followed. Reconstruction and the Civil War ended slavery, altered relationship between the states and the federal government, and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. The Emancipation Proclamation that was issued by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War actually only freed those who were enslaved in the territories that were in rebellion. Those that were enslaved in the border states like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware were not freed until the 13th Amendment. Once that is adopted, all slavery in the United States is abolished except as a form of punishment for a crime where a party has been duly convicted. The relationship between the states and the federal government changes to one that favors federal government supremacy. This was a war in which the federal government proved its supremacy over the states, and it forces the states to adopt the Reconstruction Amendments as a precondition for readmission. Finally, the definition of citizenship is redefined through the 14th Amendment. It awards citizenship to all born in the United States, regardless of skin color, national origin, ethnicity, or religion. If one is born in the United States, they are awarded citizenship rights. And the 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights for those citizens who are men. Women and American Indians are not mentioned in the 14th or 15th Amendments. Women's suffrage is not accomplished until 1920 with the 19th Amendment, and Native American citizenship, as mentioned earlier in this lecture, is not going to happen until 1924, though when it does happen, they are going to be able to vote as well. Alright, so finally for the recap. The United States continues to expand as a result of manifest destiny. Full citizenship rights were limited to white adult males in the antebellum. The territorial expansion fuels debates over slavery and leads to civil war. The North and the South's view on slavery continue to diverge. The political compromises were not enough to keep the country together, and the election of a Republican president led to South Carolina's secession. The Union's victory included factors like Lincoln's leadership and its industrial strength, and finally, Reconstruction brought an end to slavery, guaranteed new rights, but its gains were ultimately temporary. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.